The canine's ears perk up, his eyes lock onto the shadows. Danger is near. A wounded officer, a loyal canine, and one final chance for survival. But what happens next? No one could have predicted it. A police officer had no hope. Until his canine proved why dogs are heroes. A piercing silence filled the cold night air as Officer Jake Carter lay sprawled on the damp concrete, pain radiating through his body. His vision blurred, his breath shallow, each inhaling a struggle against the sharp agony in his ribs. He had been chasing a suspect through the abandoned industrial district, but the pursuit had ended in disaster. A single misstep, a hidden ledge, and now he was trapped, injured, and alone. Or almost alone. A low growl rumbled through the darkness. Max, his loyal canine partner, stood by his side, ears alert, muscles tensed. The German shepherd's golden brown eyes flickered with fierce determination as he scanned the alley for threats. His fur bristled, his sharp senses picking up something Jake couldn't. Jake tried to move, but his body screamed in protest. Blood seeped from a wound in his side, his uniform torn from the fall. The radio clipped to his vest had been shattered. No way to call for backup. No way to let anyone know he was out here, fading fast. Jake had always trusted Max, but now, in his most vulnerable moment, that trust was all he had left. Their bond had been forged through years of relentless training, countless missions, and moments where Max had proved himself over and over again. "Stay with me, buddy," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. Max let out a soft whine, stepping closer, pressing his nose against Jake's cheek, as if to reassure him. But the canine's body remained tense. He sensed danger. Then a sound. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoed through the alley. Jake's pulse quickened. Did it help, or something far worse? His fingers fumbled toward his belt, but he had lost his weapon in the fall. He was defenseless. Max's growl deepened into something raw, something primal. His body lowered, ready to strike. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. The suspect, tall, hooded, a cruel smirk curling his lips. In his hand, a weapon. Well, the man sneered, stepping forward. "Looks like you're not so tough now, officer." Jake clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay conscious. He had to think. He had to act. But the pain held him down, paralyzing him. The suspect raised his weapon. Jake felt something he had never felt before in his career. True fear. Before the suspect could act, Max lunged. The German shepherd launched himself at the man, clamping his powerful jaws onto the suspect's arm before he could pull the trigger. A scream tore through the air. The man stumbled, dropping his weapon with a metallic clang. Max didn't let go. His grip was iron, his training kicking in. The suspect tried to shake him off, but Max was relentless. A blur of fur and fury, a struggle. Then, the suspect hit the ground, pinned beneath 75 pounds of pure loyalty and determination. Jake, despite the pain, felt a wave of awe and relief. His partner had just saved his life. The man thrashed, trying to free himself. Max snarled, his grip unwavering. Jake knew he had one chance. He forced his body to move, pushing past the agony. His fingers fumbled at his belt, finding the spare handcuffs. With a final surge of strength, he secured the suspect's wrists, locking them in place. It was over, but they weren't safe yet. Jake's body sagged against the pavement, exhaustion taking over. The world around him dimmed. Max, sensing something was wrong, whined and nudged Jake's shoulder. He couldn't understand why his partner wasn't getting up. Jake struggled to focus. "Max, go," he whispered, barely audible. "Find help." Max's ears twitched. He hesitated, torn between his loyalty and his training. Then, with one last look at Jake, he turned and bolted into the night. Jake let out a shaky breath. The cold was creeping in, his body growing weaker, but he had to hold on. Max wouldn't let him down. He never had before. The wind howled through the dark, empty streets as Max bolted forward, his powerful legs pounding against the cold pavement. His breath came in rapid bursts, clouds of white mist forming with every exhale. His mind screamed at him to turn back, to return to Jake, to stand guard and protect his fallen partner. But he knew he couldn't. He had to get help. Still, every step away felt like a betrayal. Behind him, Officer Jake Carter lay motionless in the alley, his body broken and bleeding. The metallic scent of his blood lingered in the air, sharp and unmistakable. Max's ears flicked at every distant noise, scanning for threats even as he ran. He had never left Jake's side before. Not like this. A sharp pang of hesitation shot through his chest and he nearly stopped. But then he remembered Jake's weak voice. The words barely whisper. "Max, go." The command had been final. Trusting. A plea, but also an order. Jake needed him to do this. With renewed determination, Max surged forward. The street stretched ahead, dark and empty. But then, something shifted in the shadows. Max skidded to a halt, his claws scraping against the pavement. His ears twitched, his sharp gaze locking onto movement just beyond the dim glow of a streetlight. A rustling sound. A muffled voice. He wasn't alone. Max lowered himself instinctively, his muscles coiled tight like a loaded spring. His sharp teeth glistened under the flickering light, his fur bristling along his spine. Then, figures emerged from the darkness. 3 men. Their voices low, their movements cautious. Max's breath hitched. He recognized their scent instantly. The same ones Jake had chased into the industrial district, the ones responsible for this. Max's heart thundered in his chest. If they found Jake now, helpless, bleeding, he wouldn't stand a chance. One of the men stopped suddenly, glancing around. "You hear that?" he muttered. Max remained completely still, his instincts warring inside him. He could stay and fight, protect Jake at all costs, but that wasn't enough. Jake needed medical attention. Fast. A decision had to be made. Then, an idea. Max turned and ran. The sudden burst of movement caught their attention immediately. "A police dog?" one of them hissed. Max could hear them react, their footsteps pounding against the pavement as they spun toward him. "Get it!" another man shouted. Max darted forward, weaving through the alleys, leading them away from Jake. His ears flicked. Back, tracking their pursuit. They were close, too close. Then, pain. A sharp, searing force slammed into his ribs, sending him tumbling across the pavement. A choked yelp escaped him as he hit the ground hard, his vision blurring for a split. Second, his side ached. Something had struck him, a thrown object, a metal pipe, maybe a rock. But there was no time to think. Max forced himself up, ignoring the stabbing pain. His paws dug into the pavement, his legs trembling with the effort. He had to keep going. Through. The haze of pain, something caught his eye. A police cruiser. His heartbeat surged. Help. Max pushed forward with everything he had, his body screaming in protest. He bolted toward the vehicle, barking frantically, his cries echoing through the empty streets. Inside the cruiser, Officers Martinez and Lewis were scanning the streets when the barks cut through the night air. "What the—" Martinez sat up, eyes narrowing. Then he saw it. A German shepherd sprinting toward them with reckless urgency. "That's Carter's dog," Lewis realized, already pushing open the door. Max skidded to a stop beside them, his body trembling with exhaustion. He barked again, his tail flicking anxiously toward the direction he had come from. His message was clear. "Follow me." Martinez's eyes widened in alarm. "Something's wrong." Lewis didn't hesitate. "He's leading us somewhere. Let's go." Max didn't wait for them to get their bearings. The moment the officers moved, he bolted, leading them through the maze of alleys, retracing his steps with unwavering precision. Every step sent fresh jolts of pain through his side, but he ignored it. He had to. As they neared the alley, a chill crept down his spine. The criminals were already there. One of them crouched beside Jake, rifling through his belt, likely searching for a weapon. Another stood a few feet away, keeping watch. Max's lips curled back into a snarl. Not on his watch. Then a booming voice shattered the night. "Police, drop your weapons!" The criminals whipped around, their faces twisting in shock. Then, chaos. Gunfire erupted as the suspects scrambled to flee. The officers retaliated, shouting commands over the deafening noise. Max lunged forward, his body moving purely on instinct. He slammed into one of the men, knocking him off balance. His jaws clamped down on the man's wrist before he could reach for his gun. The man screamed, thrashing wildly, but Max held firm, refusing to let go. The fight was over in seconds. The other officers closed in, tackling the remaining suspects to the ground. Handcuffs clicked into place. The danger had passed, but Max didn't care about the criminals. He turned, whimpering, his gaze locking onto Jake. Jake stirred slightly, his eyelids fluttering open. His face was pale, his breathing weak. But when he saw Max, a tired smile ghosted his lips. "Max," his voice was barely above a whisper. "You did it." Max whined, lowering his head against Jake's chest, feeling the faint rhythm of his heartbeat. It was weak, but it was there. Paramedics rushed in, pushing through the aftermath of the fight. As they worked to stabilize Jake, Max refused to move. One of the officers crouched beside him, running a gentle hand over his back. "You saved his life, boy." Max barely heard him. He only cared about one thing: Jake. As Jake was lifted onto the stretcher, Max followed, his steps shaky but determined. He refused to be left behind. He would not leave Jake's side again. The paramedics exchanged glances before nodding. "Let him ride with us," one of them said. "He won't rest until he knows his partner's safe." Max climbed into the ambulance, curling up beside Jake. The familiar scent of his handler filled his nose, easing the anxiety that had gripped his chest all night. Jake lifted a trembling hand and placed it on Max's head. "You're my hero," he murmured. Max let out a soft whine and pressed his head against Jake's chest, his body finally relaxing. No matter what happened next, no matter the pain, the fear, the danger, one thing was certain: loyalty like theirs could never be broken. Jake had no hope, until Max reminded him why dogs are heroes. The alley was eerily silent, except for the distant wail of approaching sirens. A single flickering street lamp cast long shadows across the damp pavement, stretching toward the motionless body of Officer Jake Carter. His chest barely rose with each breath, his face pale, his uniform soaked with blood. And standing over him was Max, his canine partner, his guardian, his last hope. Max's muscles were tense, his ears swiveling at the slightest noise. His nose twitched, the scent of blood and sweat thick in the cold night air. The battle wasn't over. A shadow moved beyond the street lamp. Max's amber eyes locked onto the figure. A man, broad-shouldered, face obscured by the darkness. Unlike the others, this one hadn't fled when the police arrived. He had stayed behind, knife glinting in his hand. Max bared his teeth. A deep, guttural growl rumbled in his throat. He didn't care about the sirens, the backup, or even his own wounds. All he cared about was Jake. The attacker took a slow step forward. Max lowered his stance, every muscle coiled like a spring. The command Jake had whispered earlier rang in his mind. "Go, Max! Find help!" But there was no one left to fetch. The help he had found was still too far away. Now it was up to him. Max's heart pounded in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to act, to lunge, to strike. But he also knew that a single mistake could mean disaster. He had been trained for moments like these, but training didn't prepare him for the weight of responsibility, the gut-wrenching fear of failing the one person who meant everything. To him, Jake had saved him once, a young, untrained K9 discarded from another unit for being too emotional, but Jake had seen something in him. "You're not a machine, Max," Jake had told him, ruffling his fur on their first day together. "You're my partner, and I trust you." Max's breath hitched. Jake had trusted him. Now he had to prove that trust was well placed. The attacker lunged. The blade slashed through the air, whistling past Max's ear as he leaped aside. He moved. Fast, faster than the man had expected. Before the attacker could react, Max snapped his jaws shut around the man's wrist. A sharp cry of pain echoed through the alley. The knife clattered to the ground, but the fight wasn't over. The man twisted violently, wrenching his arm free. Max stumbled back but caught himself quickly. He saw the attacker's stance shift, his fists balling up, ready to strike again. Max's mind worked fast. He couldn't overpower the man directly, but he could outmaneuver him. His eyes flickered to a stack of wooden crates a few feet away. The alley was narrow. If he could force the man back just a little, Max darted forward, aiming low. His powerful body slammed into the man's legs. The attacker staggered, the crates wobbled. Then, crash! The heavy boxes toppled over, slamming onto the man's chest and pinning him to the ground. He let out a strangled yell, struggling, but it was no use, he was trapped. Max wasted no time. He darted toward the fallen knife, grabbed it in his jaws and flung it across the alley. The weapon clattered into the darkness far from reach. Threat neutralized. But Max didn't celebrate. He turned instantly, eyes back on Jake. And what he saw made his stomach twist. Jake was barely breathing. Max whimpered, stepping closer. He nudged Jake's cheek with his cold nose, urging him to wake up. Nothing. The panic hit him hard. Jake had always been the strong one, the one who reassured him, but now, lying there in a growing pool of blood, Jake looked fragile. Too still. Max's ears flicked as he remembered something about the radios officers carried. He had seen Jake press a button before speaking into it. His eyes darted to Jake's shoulder. The radio was still clipped to his vest. Max hesitated only for a second before stepping forward and carefully placing his teeth around the device. He bit down, feeling the button press inward. A crackling voice responded almost instantly. "Officer Carter, do you copy?" Max barked, loud, desperate. A brief pause. Then, "We've got a K9 alert. Officer down. Move in, now." Max exhaled shakily. Help was coming. But would it be fast enough? Pain flared through Max's own body. He hadn't noticed before, but blood dripped from a wound on his side. The earlier fight had left its mark. But it didn't matter. He forced himself to stay upright, pressing his body close to Jake's chest. He could feel the faint rise and fall beneath him. Weak, but still there. Stay with me, he thought. Just a little longer. Footsteps, shouts. The alley was suddenly flooded with flashing red and blue lights. A police officer ran toward them, kneeling beside Jake. Hands worked. Quickly, checking for a pulse, shouting orders to the medics arriving behind them. Max didn't move. He didn't trust them, not yet. Then he heard a voice. Weak, barely a whisper. "Max." His ears perked up. His tail wagged, just slightly, just enough to show he had heard. Jake's lips curled into a faint smile. His fingers, twitched, two hands moved with practiced precision, securing bandages and checking vitals. But amidst the rush of medical care, one figure refused to be left behind. Max. His fur was damp with sweat and speckled with dirt and blood, but he stood tall, his body tense, as he watched them lift Jake onto the stretcher. His ears flicked. Toward every sound, his sharp eyes never leaving his partner. A quiet hush fell over the gathered officers. They had seen K9s in action before, but this was different. This wasn't just duty. This was devotion. One officer knelt beside Max, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved him, buddy." His fingers gently ruffled Max's fur, but the dog barely acknowledged the touch. Praise didn't matter, only Jake did. Would he wake up? The doors of the ambulance swung open, and the paramedics moved quickly, securing Jake's IV lines. One of them hesitated when Max attempted to climb in, but a nod from the captain silenced any objections. "He stays." Max leaped up, settling at Jake's feet. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor filled the space. Each sound reassured Max that his partner was still alive. But was it enough? He curled up, his tail wrapping around his bruised body. He had done everything he could, fought, protected, called for help. But now, the battle was out of his paws. His mind drifted to a memory, a warm afternoon at the academy, the scent of fresh-cut grass, Jake kneeling beside him for the first time. "We're partners now, Max. That means we never give up on each other." Max nudged Jake's arm gently. Wake up, partner, please. The hospital doors swung open, and Max tensed as Jake was wheeled away. His paws scraped against the cold floor, his instincts screaming to follow. A firm hand rested on his back. Captain Reynolds. Easy, boy, they'll take care of him. Max didn't understand. How could they take care of him if he wasn't there? The double doors closed. Jake was gone. For the first time that night, fear crept into Max's heart. What? If Jake didn't come back? Hours passed. The waiting room buzzed with movement. Officers checking in, doctors murmuring updates, but none of it mattered to Max. He sat motionless, his gaze locked on the doors. Every time they swung open, his ears perked, only to flatten when Jake didn't appear. A few officers tried to comfort him. Some patted his head, others murmured soft words. But Max barely reacted. Then, movement. A nurse approached Captain Reynolds. Their conversation was quiet, but Max caught one word: partner. Reynolds turned to him, a small smile breaking his otherwise grim face. He's asking for you. That was all Max needed. He sprang to his feet, pushing past the officers, following the scent of the only person who mattered. The hospital room was dim, bathed in the soft glow of the machines monitoring Jake's vitals. The scent of antiseptic filled the air, but Max focused only on the man lying in the bed. Jake's arm was wrapped in fresh bandages, his face pale, but his chest rose and fell in steady breaths. Max hesitated. Then, Jake stirred. His eyelids fluttered, and his tired gaze searched the room, until it found Max. A slow, weak smile spread across his lips. There you are, buddy. Max let out a soft huff and padded forward, resting his head on the bed. Jake's fingers curled weakly into his fur. I knew you wouldn't let me down. Max sighed, closing his eyes. He had his answer. Jake had come back. They sat in silence, but words weren't needed. Jake knew. He knew what Max had done, how he had fought, how he had called for help. And Max knew what Jake had done too. He had trusted him, believed in him, even in unconsciousness. Jake swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. They told me, Max, how you wouldn't leave me. Max nudged his hand. Of course I wouldn't. A tear slipped from the corner of Jake's eye. I don't deserve you. Max disagreed, and he made it clear by licking Jake's fingers. Days turned into weeks. Jake healed, and so did Max. But something had changed between them. Their bond had always been strong. Now it was unbreakable. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jake sat on the porch, watching the world fade into twilight. Max curled at his feet, his head resting on Jake's knee. Jake ran his fingers through Max's fur. I always thought I was the one protecting you, he murmured. But I think you were always meant to protect me. Max thumped his tail. Jake exhaled slowly, peace settling over him. I won't take this life for granted anymore. Max stretched, closing his eyes. They had both changed, and they would face whatever came next, together. A few weeks later, the precinct gathered in a small but heartfelt ceremony. Officers lined up in dress uniforms, the station filled with an air of quiet admiration. Jake stood tall beside Max, his uniform crisp, his arm still in a sling. The chief stepped forward, clearing his throat. Tonight, we honor an officer who went beyond duty, a partner who proved that heroes don't just wear badges, some have paws. Jake glanced down, smiling. That's you, buddy. The room erupted in applause, but Max didn't care about the recognition. He cared about the man beside him, because no matter what, Jake was his partner. And Max had proven once and for all why dogs were heroes.